Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today for the live event conversation with Sue William Silverman. Thank you so much for coming, Sue.
Well, thank
It's
you for having me. It's
wonderful,
delightful to be here.
wonderful to have you, and I'm excited for our conversation. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Karin Gutman. I'm the founder of Spirit of Story, and that's devoted to mentoring writers really as they develop and write their personal stories. So let me tell you a little bit about Sue. So Sue William Silverman, she's an award-winning memoirist, essayist, poet of 8 books, including Lovesick, One Woman's Journey Through Sexual Addiction, which was made into a Lifetime movie, and How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences. She has written 2 craft books on memoir, including her most recently published Acetylene Torch Songs, Writing True Stories to Ignite the Soul, which draws on her 25 years of teaching and mentoring memoir writers, or I guess writers in general. Yeah, all kinds of writers.
Yes.
She teaches in the MFA in writing program at Vermont College of Fine Arts.
Yes.
So I was first introduced to your work reading Fearless Confessions, which was your first
Okay.
craft book on
Yeah.
memoir.
Yes.
Okay. That was published in 2009, correct? So you
That I don't even remember, but I'm sure that's right.
so
Uh,
the point being that you've been at this a very long time.
yeah.
So I'm just curious, how your understanding of memoir has grown and deepened over the years.
Yeah. I mean, when I wrote that first craft book, Fearless Confessions, I thought, well, that's really all I have to say about craft. But then over the years, as I teach, and so teaching at Vermont College of Fine Arts, every residency, we give lectures on different craft topics for the students. And so I had to keep developing my thinking. And so it's really a result of continuing to give lectures about it that I saw creative nonfiction in a deeper way and more about the new book, Settling Torch Songs, has more about metaphor and how metaphor really can tie the whole of either a personal essay or a memoir together, sort of the necessity of it. And also, since I wrote Fearless Confessions, I wrote 2 memoir in essay form books, How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences, and The Papoon Fan Club, My Life as a White Anglo-Saxon Jew. And so I also wanted to write about how you sort of form an essay collection, which the first book didn't have at all.
Hmm.
And like you have all these sort of seemingly disparate essays lying around. How do you get them together into a cohesive, coherent, thematically congruent whole? So that's part of it. And then thinking more deeply about voice and what goes into it, and thinking more about the narrator, how and the narrator's voice, how every book I write, and to some extent every essay, really has its own voice. Like, as beginning writers, we're told, well, find your voice. Well, that's all well and good, but there really isn't one voice. It's really finding the voice of the piece at hand, so that most of my books do. I mean, they all sort of have my kind of literary sound to it, but at the same time, the voices really are different. And so it's a matter of finding what voice best fits this material.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just my thinking along those lines is just really broadened in
Mm-hmm.
that way. So I thought, maybe time for another craft book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You speak about the essay form and kind of focusing more on it just tangentially. The memoir and essays seems to be more acceptable in terms of the publishing world. Are you finding that? Was that at all the inspiration for kind of turning your focus to the essay form, because it's there seemed to be these kind of hybrid of not only a collection, but like this blend between memoir and essays.
It's not, I really don't write for what maybe is in vogue because I would fail at it because I can really only write what I feel. But it's more that, so my first memoir was How to Survive. My first memoir was Because I Remember Terror, Father, I Remember You. It's about growing up in my incestuous family. And then the second memoir was Love Sick, about my 28 days in rehab for sex addiction. After I wrote those two memoirs, it was more that I really did not have another like straight through narrative that could be one whole. I that was sort of it, but I knew I had to keep writing. So I found these shorter moments in time to write about that would only be maybe, anywhere from maybe 10 to 20, 25 pages. And so that's really, it's just that I did not have another long narrative in me. But I do have a lot of these just shorter moments in time. So that's really what brought me to the essay. And initially, when I first started writing essays, I just kind of kept writing them and I'd send some out to try to get published. And I didn't even think in terms of collecting them in a book. And so the first one was this Papoon fan club, My Life as a White Anglo-Saxon Jew. And at some point, I may have been like 2, 3 years into it when I suddenly realized, thematically, these are sort of speaking to each other, that they are sort of about, my misguided search for spirituality. And so Pat Boone being one of them. I mean, when I was a little kid, basically, I wanted him to adopt me. I mean, he was the complete antithesis of my Jewish father who was molesting me. So Pat Boone is a squeaky clean, Christian man, and he had already had 4 daughters. And when he noticed if he had another one sort of move in, that kind of thing. I mean, and it's sort of, the book is kind of ironic because I have nothing, I mean, the thought of Pat Boone being my father is sort of horrifying right now because he's very right-wing conservative and I'm quite liberal Democrat. But yet he played a big role in my life. But anyway, so I was writing these essays about different ways that I had been seeking like kind of a higher power or something to believe in. And so as I say, I didn't start out thinking that way at all. And I was really about 2 years into it before I realized, there is a sort of commonality here. But when I realized that, I also had to then go back and revise some essays, change some titles to make sure that they were all thematically coherent. But I will say about the publishing industry that the whole idea of this memoir and essay form is relatively new. At one point, publishers really were very leery of essay collections. But once writers started making them, giving them a theme so that they were sort of connected, that's when it began to take off. Like, I don't think that they're that interested in just sort of random essays where one doesn't really speak to the other. But this idea of still being a sort of coherent whole is something that speaks to publishers now.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, what I love about this book, this craft book, is that you're not only, sort of teaching us about the craft of memoir, but you're really drawing on your own writing through it as examples. And we were just chatting before, just like giving not only examples, but even before and after examples, like what, kind of really elucidating the points that you're trying to make. And it's very accessible. And I feel like something I might even learn, it's hard to learn from books versus like you as a teacher in the classroom, but I really feel like you've translated that so brilliantly.
Thank you.
And for those who are listening, there's also just some incredible prompts in there, because I've been doing the prompts as I've read through the books, and it's generated some incredible material and really opened some avenues for me. So I want to
Well,
just sing the praises of this book.
well, thank you. That makes me very happy to know that. Yeah, the idea of so each chapter is about sort of a different craft topic. And that came first. And when I was working on those, I realized that I'm giving this advice. Can I actually follow my own advice? And so that's what sort of brought me to think, well, I really want to, plus just to make the book, the writing of the book more interesting to me, I wanted to try to sort of challenge myself and write essays that would speak to, say, the chapter on voice or the chapter on sensory detail, stuff like that. So I did, and it did. The writing of it was more interesting to me just to see, how I could sort of follow my own advice.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said before, the memoir, memoir as a topic, as a focus really anchors the book. I mean, it's not the only thing you talk about, but you really spend quite a bit of time on this idea of metaphor. And I really want to take, sort of use our time together to sink into that and talk about it in a way that hopefully, listeners can then sort of go home and maybe sink into their own writing and have ways of really, I mean, really the term I use, because the course that I teach is called Unlocking Your Story. And I really feel like this metaphor, if you can access the metaphors that are guiding your life and then your story, you're really unlocking your story, as it were, on a deeper level.
That's really true. I mean, even as I say that, even though the book has these chapters on these different sort of craft topics, running throughout the book is the idea of metaphor, because metaphor is really only through metaphor that we're able to transform our lives into art. Because writing either personal essay or memoir is not just Xeroxing your life like this happened to me and then this happened to me. It's really going much deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why, and really the only way to do that is through metaphor. And I know just the word metaphor itself can seem sort of abstract, but what metaphor is, it sort of means taking a particular detail or image and giving that detail or image an emotional depth. I mean, that's how we turn our life into art. And we want to turn our life into art because we want to make our story universal, so that a story about me could also resonate with you, even if we've had different experiences. So a metaphor, I want to take sort of showcase my interior emotion, how I as narrator am feeling, and I do that through an external object. So we slant or depict sensory details objects so that they metaphorically cast light on the interiority of the narrator. And if you like, I can give you sort of a concrete example.
Yeah, that would be excellent.
So that is to really sort of show what I mean. So this example is from my memoir, Love Sick. And as I said, that's about the time I spent in recovery for 28 days for sex addiction. So let me just briefly set up the scene. In this scene, I'm a freshman in college, and I'm having an affair with a man old enough to be my father. He wears this maroon cashmere scarf, and I want this scarf. And one evening after he drops me off at my dorm, I can't remember if I sort of took it from him or he gave it to me, but anyway, I end up with the scarf. So he drops me off at my dorm. And this, it's just a short paragraph. And so here I am. I'm not with him for the evening anymore. I'm alone. It's later in my dorm. And this is what I write. I press the scarf against my nose and mouth. I take a deep breath. The scent is of him, leaves smoldering in autumn dusk. And I believe it is a scent I have always craved, one I will always want. I don't understand why the scent of the scarf seems more knowable, more tangible than the rest of him. Okay, so first let's just consider the memory itself. When I only, let's say, would be sitting around thinking about this man and his maroon scarf, before I wrote it, it was only a scarf. I mean, that's all it was, just this maroon scarf that I took from this man and I returned to my dorm. And that's really all I sort of vaguely remembered. However, once I started writing, and that's why we do write our stories, once I started writing, the image of the maroon scarf deepened and took on more significance. So it's through the writing process that this memory of the maroon scarf was transformed from merely a maroon scarf to a sensory depiction, resulting in a metaphor. So let me reread this part. So this is what happened when I wrote. I'm going to reread part of what I just wrote. The scent is, so I'm pressing the scarf against my nose and mouth. The scent is of him, leaves smoldering in autumn dusk. And I believe it is the scent I have always craved, one I will always want. I don't understand why the scent of the scarf seems more knowable, more tangible than the rest of him. Okay, so to reiterate, in this transformation, once I added the sensory detail of that leaves smoldering in autumn dusk, which is a scent more knowable than the man, that's when the scarf becomes a metaphor. And it becomes a metaphor sort of depicting loss and longing, desire for love. I mean, the man was married, I'm sure he was a sex addict too. We were never going to really love each other. So I couldn't have the man. All I could have was the scarf. So the scarf becomes like a stand-in or a metaphor for the loss that I felt around the man, or just the loss that I felt that I didn't really know what love was. So a metaphor simply gives these abstract universal emotions like loss a tangible quality. Like if I just told you, oh yeah, so I had this affair, this man, and I felt a sense of loss, that you couldn't relate to that as a reader. It's just the word loss is just way too abstract.
Mm.
So you need to take these abstract emotions and give them this tangible quality, because we just cannot feel abstractions. So instead, through writing, and that's where you discover your metaphors, I have to show the reader the loss by using these tangible sensory details, such as, in this case, the scarf. But I want to hasten to add that in writing this book for I don't know, the first 20,000 drafts, the scarf was only a scarf. It's not like I know my metaphors before I begin writing. It was only like on the 20,000th and one draft or whatever that I thought, oh, there's really a lot of energy around this scarf. What does it really mean? So that's when I started pushing myself to go deeper, to really understand its significance. And so we don't impose metaphors upon the work. We sort of let them rise up from these sensory details that are already sort of forming in the text, but then we just start paying attention to them more. And how can this, anything can be a metaphor, pencil can be a metaphor. And in another context, let's say I met a man who wore a maroon scarf and he turned out to be a lovely person and he wasn't married and we ended up marrying and I still got his maroon scarf. Then that maroon scarf would be a metaphor that's say for love. So that's why we have to slant and frame these details for the emotion at hand.
I love that that turn of phrase, telling it slant. And I think you've explained it really well. I wanted to read Emma, was it Emily Dickinson
Emily
that
Dickinson, yes,
that
yeah,
first kind of coined that phrase. She said,
yes,
by telling it slant, feelings are elucidated. Um, so the vocabulary also that you use in the book, I find really fresh and yeah, helps me kind of connect with memoir and the craft of it in new ways. And I mean, I know telling it slant is sort of an old, you know, goes back to Emily Dickinson, but there's some fresh language too. I mean, one of the things that you talk about, which I think we can kind of connects to what you were just describing with metaphor, is that memoir is both microscopic and telescopic. Can you kind of use that example as a way to explain what you mean by that?
yeah. So by looking at the smallest possible detail, like putting it under a microscope, like this maroon scarf, like really putting it under a microscope and examining it in its minute detail, it becomes more telescopic so that a reader can then feel the emotion that the narrator is feeling. Like, unless, let's say, and I don't wish this on anybody, but unless, say, you had an affair in college with a married man old enough to be your father who wore this maroon scarf, you wouldn't be able to identify with that if that's all I had. But um, so that's why we have to, have our metaphors. And so by putting this maroon scarf under a microscope and really examining it in this minute detail, then it really does cast a wider, more complete context for what this means so that you could feel my sense of loss. And so it becomes telescopic because once you can feel my sense of loss, then you can relate to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Almost like the image or the object of the scarf, you're really looking for the emotion that lives inside of that scarf.
That's exactly
Right.
what it is.
And then you're tapping into what's universal because you're tapping into kind of a universal emotional truth that we can all relate to. Would that be accurate?
That's exactly it. Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. We give these external sensory details, these objects, uh, a sense of meaning so that it's not just a maroon scarf. It is sort of almost like a living object. And so the way I describe that scarf sheds light on how the narrator is feeling in that moment. And by shedding light on how I, as narrator, am feeling in that moment, then that is projected out onto the reader.
Mhm.
So that the reader can then more have empathy for the narrator and feels sympathetic and come to understand the narrator better. I mean, and I mean, it's true for whatever we write, but when you're writing about, I mean, in Lovesick, I write about a lot of my bad behaviors. And so, but I want the reader to feel empathy for me as narrator. And the way to do that is through metaphor to show that, okay, but this narrator is really struggling
Mm.
and she can only find kind of some comfort in this maroon scarf, even though, so, I mean, yes, the maroon scarf is metaphor for loss, but it also is kind of a metaphor for desire for love.
Mm.
I mean, these objects that we use, they can be a metaphor for more than one thing.
Mhm.
And the more metaphoric they are, sort of the deeper your work is going to go.
Mhm. Mhm. You also use the equation memory plus metaphor equals meaning. And as you're talking, I'm thinking, oh, well, it kind of really also speaks to this idea of like memory. And what if, I don't know how much you remembered from that scene when you first started writing, when you were holding the scarf, or maybe that's the only thing you remembered. And the beauty is that you can use the memories that really stick with us are the memories to mine, right? Are the images to mine. You don't have to remember the whole scene and everything that happened and what you were wearing necessarily, or right?
Right.
You can work with that
That's right.
one object to really bring to life that whole scene and
Right.
why it matters. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because I mean, I really, all I do remember is like I had the scarf when I left his car. I went up to my dorm room. I was just sitting on my bed in the dorm room and, just sort of pressing it, just kind of smelling it and kind of wrapping it around myself. And that was it. And that's all I said. Well, that's kind of boring. And, but that's why, when we write creative nonfiction, we're both looking back, but we're doing so with the very present narrator. There are almost two narrators. There's the narrator in the present, the more aware narrator, who is trying to make sense of the past. And so, did I have any of those insights back then as a college freshman? Not a one. I mean, I was
Mhm.
lost completely, falling apart, little college freshman. So that narrator from the past would not be able to communicate or investigate or explore or reflect upon any of this. So that's why we have to bring our present awareness
Mm.
to the writing and make sense of this. We make sense of the past, through our present selves as authors, narrators.
Mhm. The one that can make meaning as you're looking back, right?
Exactly, exactly.
So, I mean, that's another terms that are fresh for me, like the aware and the unaware voice versus I've just heard, you know, I've used the term voice of innocence and the voice of perspective. Are those interchangeable for you?
Yeah, I mean,
Is it-
actually, in Fearless Confessions, I do use the voice of innocence, the voice of experience. Um, and I switch. I think a lot of people related to that, but I wanted to be maybe even more specific. So in Settling Torch Songs, I switched the two voices to the unaware voice and the aware voice, um, because the unaware voice is part of the story. I mean, it does tell the basic thing, like the
Mhm.
basics. The unaware voice in that particular scene is the one who remembers wanting the scarf, taking the scarf, returning her to her dorm room.
Mhm.
That's part of the story, and we need that part of the story. Then to that unaware voice, we add the aware voice who now has to make sense
Mhm.
of what did that scarf mean to her?
Mhm.
Why did she need that scarf? I mean, she had to have it. Like she wasn't going to get out of the car without it.
Mhm.
And so, but why? That wasn't anything that the unaware voice questioned in the past. It's just wanted the scarf.
Mhm.
But then the aware voice makes sense that the scent of autumn dusk, and
Mhm.
the scarf is going to be more knowable, more tangible than the man. And so that's what the aware voice has to step in and
Mhm.
make sense of that moment.
Mhm. Mhm. Which again, another, terms you use are, making the unaware voice is sort of the anecdotal version, right? You're just saying sort of what happened,
Exactly. It
the
is.
basic facts.
Yeah, it's like this happened, then this happened, then this happened.
Mhm.
You know, it's like what I was saying before about Pat Boone back when I was a little teeny bopper. Yeah, I wanted him to adopt me. I liked his voice. I mean, just that was sort of it. It was very, oh, I have a crush on Pat Boone.
Mhm.
It was
Mhm.
very, very teeny bopper. And so it wasn't until much later that, I mean, Pat Boone then became a metaphor. I mean, people are metaphors for us as well, that he became a metaphor of a father that I thought I really wanted, because he was the complete antithesis of my own father. So it wasn't until I started writing about him that I realized, oh, Pat Boone, you were just a metaphor all along. That's all you were. And uh, so
Yeah.
that's why we write.
How did that feel to realize, oh, I mean, it's almost like you're dismissing him now.
Well, I'm not in that. At the time, he really did serve a purpose. I mean, he knowing, I mean, the way I interpreted him then, that he was a safe father, that he had these 4 daughters, and that he was this sort of squeaky clean image, whatever he was like in reality. Who knows? He's a celebrity, right? But so he was sort of gave me hope, like something to hold on to believe in. So, I mean, the whole book is not about Pat Boone at all. There may be about 3 essays about Pat Boone, but sort of the upshot is that it's mixed. I mean, no, he's not a spiritual icon for me because we're very different. But back when I was a kid, he was very meaningful to me. And because he did give me hope that there were sort of safe men out there. And then years later, when I actually did meet him in person, right before, which was what sort of prompted the book, and I gave him a copy of my first book, and I met him. He invited me to come backstage to the green room, and I met with him, and he said to me, that he'd read my book, and he said, Sue, you remind me of a flower growing up through concrete. He had this photograph in his house of a flower growing up through concrete. And so he did hear me. And so in some ways, I mean, he did hear me more than my real father did. So so the essays about him, they're not like being a fan, like, oh, he's so wonderful. But it's also not just kind of condemning him for his politics or how different we view him. It's really, as it should be, ambiguous, in that he did represent something very positive for me. He did ultimately read my books and hear my voice. And so it's complex. And I do feel that ultimately he saw me more than my real father did.
I love that he delivered a metaphor right back to you.
Yeah, right. I know. So, and we're still sort of in touch every now and then.
Oh,
I mean,
wow. That's amazing.
I know.
So he is a real person. He's not just a metaphor.
He's both.
He's both.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's move into like helping our writers here. So I mean, as you teach, which is so helpful, like kind of if you could put on your teaching hat, like where do you begin with writers when they're just maybe like even just starting, like, oh, I want to write about, the sort of event in my life. I've always wanted to write about X. Where do you suggest beginning and then sort of following up to that? Like at what point do you start mining for the metaphors inside of that raw material, really?
Right. You begin with, first of all, sensory details. Like you're in a moment. Well, first, set yourself in a specific moment of time. Really ground yourself in one specific place. And it can be like a room in the house. It can be a city where you live. But where is the narrator located? So you want to ground yourself, locate yourself in specificity. And then look around. What does this place smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? Just go through the senses, do a sensory inventory, and just start collecting all the senses and the images that are in your house. Let's say where you are now, all those books in your bookshelf, and any, like I see a few little knickknacks and stuff. So, I mean, you would start focusing on the very small sensory details. So include them in, they're there for a reason. They mean something to you. We maybe don't know why right now, but we start off there. And as you keep writing and revising, you really won't discover probably the deepest significance of any of these details until you're several drafts in. But then or, okay, behind me there's a jar of marbles. I love marbles. And I'm not sure if I've ever, maybe sort of have written about marbles, but uh, so initially I would include, oh, I have a jar of marbles on my desk. And for a long time, there's just a jar of marbles. And then ultimately, if I keep writing about these marbles, what do they really mean to me? And in part, it's just this kind of glittery glass stuff that I really like. So why do I really like it? So I can't tell you that now because I haven't written about it. But if I were writing about it, then I would have to keep writing about these marbles until I really understood what they're a metaphor for. I mean, I could sort of guess, like, to me, marbles sort of brighten the world, and I see a lot of darkness in the world. And so it could be something like that. I don't know. Because when I am just sort of thinking and talking about them, I usually won't discover my metaphors.
Right.
But you just keep going deeper and deeper into these little objects and details until you really come to understand what this means. So you start off just grounding yourself in a specific place, like try not to start off in some abstraction, like just in thoughts, like just I'm thinking about this, because that's what all that's going to do, is sort of like let the reader, it's almost like putting a thesis sentence, like this essay is going to be about blank. And you don't want to sort of start off with like a thesis sentence like that. So plunge yourself right into a scene. There's an action, something happened. What just happened that jump starts this essay into being, or this memoir into being? Like in the essay, the Pat Boone Fan Club, it starts off with, I'm an adult now, and he's doing a golden oldies tour at this church not far from my house. So I go to the concert. So it starts when I first see him on stage. It's like, oh, it's Pat Boone. And so what just happened to jumpstart this action into being? It has to be something specific. That's where you get your action going. And then as you start with that action, you start filling in the details of sensory details of what are in that scene. So like I described what Pat Boone is wearing and how he looks, sort of very patriotic, rah stuff, which is not me. But and you just build it from there.
And where do you recall where the first, so as you start, I'm just talking about the Pat Boone essay, and you started there, do you recall what the initial metaphor that showed itself, or like how you started working with metaphor in that particular essay? Do you recall seeing him on stage? And
yeah, I mean, when he's saying, so he's saying April Love, he's like, I don't know, 80 years old now. And he asked a young girl to come up on stage, and he was going to sing April Love to her. And it was sort of creepy, really. And I realized, Pat Boone, you don't really want to be doing this, do you? And so I started seeing him in a more realistic light, that, yeah, it was pretty cool back when he was, in his 20s or so, you could sing April Love, but to sing it now when you're like 80 or close to 80 to this, and the young girl who came up on stage just looked mortified. And so I started realizing more the kind of depth around Pat Boone, that both the complexity and the superficiality of him, so that I could see it was, because I couldn't just write like, as I say, a fan thing essay about him, because that's really boring. But I also didn't want to just trash him, because there is this sort of middle ground. And so I think that's why, for me at least, as Pat Boone as metaphor became rather interesting, in that he could be this sort of squeaky clean image that I revered in the past, be a metaphor for that safe father. And he could also be that he never grew up. He's still like Pat Boone from back in the early 60s. And so he's not like changed with the times or anything. So he's not really somebody I would have wanted as a father. It would have been sort of scary, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but yet that was good for art because I could make him more complex.
I was going to say that's a very complex opening to the essay.
Yeah. So it's not, I mean, that's what we sort of want our metaphors to be as much as possible. You know, to be sort of not ambiguous in the bad sense of the word, but to be meaningful in many different ways. As I said, like that maroon scarf is a metaphor for loss and longing, but it's also a metaphor for love. I couldn't really love the man. He couldn't really love me, but I could love this scarf. And it was soft. It was cashmere. So it gave me comfort. So it's a, you know, you can read that metaphor, that scarf, in different ways. And as much as we can do that, that's what really deepens our work.
So if you're working on a full-length memoir, is there typically a metaphor that's guiding the whole work? Because what you're talking about right now is like dropping into a very specific scene, a specific moment. But what about like sort of looking at the narrative holistically and the arc?
Yes. Here's sort of how I see it, that every book we write, whether it's an essay collection or just one straight through narrative memoir, does sort of have an overriding metaphor. Like, let's say in Lovesick, the overriding metaphor is really language, that I didn't know the difference between love and sex, between safety and danger. Like, as an addict, I thought like, oh, these dangerous men, loving them was like love, and that I didn't see them as dangerous. So it's like a very confused, so the metaphor is sort of this confusion of language. So that's like the overriding theme and the overriding metaphor. But then within each, you know, scene or chapter, there will be individual metaphors that will either directly speak to the overriding thing or will be sort of variations on the metaphor. So the piece as a whole is metaphoric. It's not like, oh, I think I need a metaphor on page 10, and now I'm on page 20. Maybe I need another metaphor. You really want to kind of sustain as much as possible, and it's not going to happen all throughout, but every scene and the objects in the scene can be slanted or crafted metaphorically, so that you're constantly going deeper and deeper into the narrative. So at the end, you will have reached a place of a wider understanding, a deeper understanding of yourself as narrator, and the reader will too. So that, like, let's say at the end of a memoir, you will have a different worldview of yourself, of the world, than who you were at the beginning. And that's all is transmitted through metaphor, through your metaphors deepening the theme.
And understanding the metaphors in a different way. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, they do shift over time for sure, because, and that's where that aware voice comes in. Like, it would be something like, obviously you wouldn't put it like this, but, you know, back on page 5, I thought Pat Boone or this maroon scarf was a metaphor for this. Now, X, Y, and Z has happened to me. These other events have occurred to me. So now I see these things as metaphors for kind of an evolution of the metaphor. So that because that's how, an essay or a memoir is not going to just stay on one flat line. Think of it as a quest. Like you start out wanting to learn something about yourself or wanting to understand, like, what do I want? What is the point of this whole book? So in Lovesick, the whole point is to try to get in recovery, right? And so I could be like, be more adult in my behaviors. And so that's a quest I'm on, is how do I become this person who I really want to be? And so the metaphors do change. They deepen. Things happen when I'm in rehab for 28 days, in addition to these sort of flashbacks. But, and so the narrator evolves. And so as the narrator evolves, the metaphors are going to evolve as well.
And that when you said that the overarching metaphor has to do with language, so that's not really grounding it in a specific object or person, like it's a little bit more abstract, right? Language.
Yeah, well, but words are very concrete, though. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and there is an element of truth to that, of course, but words are kind of symbols and metaphors. But I also had to give concrete details to those. Like if I'm writing about, say, this man with a maroon scarf, he's concrete, and I could say, oh, I think I really love him, when it's clearly obvious there's no love there. It's just this sort of sordid affair. So so I can call it love, I can call it safety, and then learn over the course of this quest, this journey, that wasn't love, that wasn't safety. But words are symbol, they're symbolic. So in that sense, that's sort of what I meant.
Well, I want to open up to, I just want to encourage people who are here to ask questions. I would love to continue to talk to you about some other aspects of the craft too, but we have one here. Does voice, language, or diction also shift, evolve as we go from the unaware voice to the aware voice?
Yes, it definitely can. But you can also, it's not like, say, your essay or memoir doesn't necessarily just begin in the unaware voice, and then like halfway through, maybe it switches to the aware voice. It's not like that so much. Like you can have the unaware voice and the aware voice all in one paragraph, which is in that what I just read from Lovesick. So, okay, let me just break that down. So alone later in the dorm, I press the scarf against my nose and mouth. I take a deep breath. That's the unaware voice, right? Just saying what happened. This is what happened. So that paragraph, just in that one paragraph, starts with the unaware voice. And then it starts to shift from the unaware to the aware. The scent is of him. So that's sort of beginning to move from the unaware to the aware. Leaves smoldering in autumn dusk. Now I'm full on into the aware voice. And I believe it is a scent I've always craved, one I will always want. I don't understand why the scent of the scarf seems more knowable, more tangible than the rest of him. So just in that one paragraph, you have both voices. And I mean, there's no hard and fast rule to this, which is both good and sort of complicated. But I mean, because you can go for pages in the unaware voice where you're just really setting up an action of what happened. And then you can also go for pages of the aware voice, which is sort of reflecting on what that action is. I will say this, though. It usually works better and can maybe only work, is that you have to sort of have the unaware voice first, because you have to have the story down first. Like, what is the story? What is happening? Because you can't reflect upon something that hasn't happened, right? So frequently, in any given scene or the beginning of any chapter, or the beginning of an essay, you will usually start in this unaware voice that is telling the story of something that happened. And then the aware voice kicks in. Okay, that just happened, but what does that mean?
Mhm.
I need to reflect upon it and come to understand it. So that's sort of how they work together in many ways. But as I say, you can go pages, but don't think that like the whole first half of an essay or the whole first half of a memoir has to be just this unaware voice. And all of a sudden the aware voice pops in to make sense of it all, because that would be more like a summing up.
Mhm.
So you want to try to weave them together as much as
Mhm.
possible.
Mhm. Makes sense. Um, we have such a great example of how to make that transition, Sue. It's so tricky for many of us to effectively switch back and forth between the unaware and the aware voice. And in some, I mean, in some books, it's more obvious. I think the distinguishing between the two voice, I guess, and some people use the term wise voice and the innocent voice. And
Yeah.
in some books, I think that telling the wise voice is a heavier hand, right? Wouldn't you say that and sometimes it's harder to distinguish between the two that are seamlessly woven? What's your take
Yeah.
on that?
Um, it is, but again, it's sort of like over the course. I mean, that's why it's all about revision. And I wouldn't even get too hung up about it in like the first draft. The first draft, just sort of kind of write with your heart, like what really needs to come out. And after you've gotten a lot of that down, then start thinking more with your brain, like how can I make this metaphor? What do I really have to explain, or not explain, but what do I really have to reflect on? And over time, sort of the two voices will become more seamless so that
Mm,
they can sort of flow together in many
mm,
ways. But that's just something, you know, writing is tough. We probably all know that.
mm,
And it's sort of supposed to be, because otherwise it's not interesting if it came too easy. Just
mm,
slap this thing out. What does it mean? Um, because to me, writing is kind of like being a detective and discovering the secrets of my life, like
mm,
what the secrets mean. And so you can't get that on the first draft. At least I sure can't. And so the more we write, then, and the more we revise each piece, those two voices, you'll sort of figure out when each needs to sort of take its place in the narrative.
mhm, mhm. Is there also an inherent arc in a memoir and essays? Could you elaborate on how the arc works there?
Yeah, there is, because as I said, there is a sense, whether you're writing a personal, not, let me say this is probably more for traditional work than sort of speculative work, or but say in more traditional memoir or personal essay, there is going to be an arc, because the narrator is on a quest. Something just happened to me. I want to understand it. What does it mean? So the arc is that quest of trying to figure out what this happening means. So it's not so, but there's sort of an arc to the story. That unaware voice has its own arc of the story of what happened, because of what happened changes over time. Eventually, like this man with the moon scarf, we break up and stuff. So there is this external arc, but then there's this internal arc, the emotional arc of how we change emotionally over time. So these two arcs are kind of always circling each other, but ultimately they will bring you at the end of the piece to a place of new awareness.
Mhm,
So at the beginning, I'm kind of lost. I'm trying to figure this out. I'm just entering rehab for 28 days. I'm a complete mess. Um, I sort of want to get better, but the addict part of me wants no part of rehab. So I go in kicking and screaming, don't want to be there, but sort of know I have to be there. So I'm a mess at the beginning. When I end, I'm not like, oh, I'm cured now. But so it's not like you have to have some big epiphany, but the narrator is in a much more stable place. So that's the arc. She starts out very lost, confused, conflicted. She leaves somewhat less lost, somewhat less conflicted, but in a much safer place on how to proceed with her life.
And are you referring to a memoir and essays? Are you referring to your essay?
No,
Okay.
that's like say
A memoir, like a
in
more
love's
traditional,
a more tradition in a memoir and essays, there also can be an arc. It's sort of like each essay is going to have its little arc, and then there's going to be a more overriding arc. So like in my book, How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences. So that's basically like, I'm terrified of dying. And I'm a hypochondriac. So I think every, headache is a major brain tumor, right? So, but the arc of that, so each essay, and the book isn't just about like physically dying, it's also about these little emotional deaths that we all undergo, like, loss, divorce, addiction, stuff like that. But so over time in How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences, the arc is like, oh, there is a way to survive death if you're a writer. You write your life and the book can live forever. I mean, it's not quite as pointed as that. It's more abstract, but there are these awarenesses. So it's not, but as I say, each essay is going to have its own sort of mini arc, and then there's going to be and its own sort of mini metaphors, and then they're going to be more overriding ones. But like in a straight through memoir, like Lovesick, it's the arc is clearer because it's one narrative, it's one straight through narrative.
Like a plot that you're following.
Exactly, like sort of like a novel, a plot in a novel. Yeah.
No, that was a great way of describing how the memoir and essays arc. So I just want to touch on a couple aspects of craft if you have a few minutes here.
Sure, absolutely.
I wanted to talk about tense. So it sounds like you have a preference just yourself towards the present tense. And I was just, it comes up kind of a lot with
It
writers,
does.
like which tense? And I always think, well, it doesn't, it's like don't get so hung up on that. Like it's okay anyway. Try, experiment, try it out, different things. But one of my questions is, one, I just kind of want to hear why you have a preference for present. And two, it seems that this wouldn't be the case, but does it affect at all the insights that you can have along the way to write in present? Like, does writing in past tense does it give the aware voice more latitude to offer insight and reflection?
See, I
think
the present tense offers you more latitude because who's actually kind of masterminding the book? It's me, the author, in the present. So it's the aware voice that's really calling the shots in many ways. It's making sense of the story. And so I am here in the present, making sense of the past. And so, I mean, when I first started with my first book, because I remember Terrifather, I remember you, I didn't even think about tense. I mean, I never even read a memoir. I mean, I hate to admit that, but I really had never read a memoir. Well, I read the Diary of Anne Frank, but that doesn't count because, it's Anne Frank, right? And so I never really read a memoir. So I just plunged into this memoir, and it just came out in present tense. There was no intellectual decision made. I didn't think about it. That's just how it came out. That was it. And then when I started Lovesick, again, it just came out in present tense. And I never thought about it until people kept asking me about it. I thought, oh, maybe there's a reason. So then I had to come up with a good logical reason when people asked me the question. And as it turns out, it really is, that does make sense to me. I mean, but there's no right or wrong way, everybody. Really, it's your way. How does it sound best to you? And I have written essays in past tense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what it's sort of like finding the voice. What is the best voice for this particular piece? What's the best tense for this particular piece?
Mm-hmm. So it's not really a pros and cons. It's more about voice, which I think is
Yeah.
liberating.
Yeah. And to me, as I say, that I feel like when I know that I'm the author narrator who really is trying to make sense of that, and I am in the present, I'm sitting here at my computer right now today writing, then it seems logical to make it in the present tense.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me, it seems more immediate to the reader. Oh my God, this is happening now. And so it might heighten the tension for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a comfortable tense for me.
Mm-hmm. Great. I also wanted to touch on imagination and speculation in memoir, because I think there's sort of like a presumption, like, oh, well, we're telling the truth, so you can't speculate. You can't, like, I think just the concept is a little like maybe at first glance doesn't seem to go hand in hand with memoir. Can you speak
Right.
to speculation and
Yes.
imagination and why it's so important?
Yes. So if we're imagining stuff, our imaginations are part of us, right? So it's not making stuff up. So the tricky part is just to be sure that your reader knows when you're imagining and speculating. So, because no, we can't just make stuff up. We can't just lie about things. But our imagination and what we speculate, like, oh, I wasn't even born yet, but what was it like for my grandparents fleeing the pogroms of Russia to come to the New World? Obviously, was not born yet. But I can speculate about what that must have been like because that is still part of my family history. And so if I'm speculating and imagining, then those are coming from, like my brain, my heart. And so it's not making anything up. It's just what I think might have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think might have happened is probably still going to be pretty close to truth because you hear your family stories, or or if you want to speculate on, I wonder what's going to happen in the future, like who's going to win the presidential election, which everybody's sort of hyperventilating about. I mean, I can speculate about that, and not I wouldn't do it as a newscaster because there's way too much speculation with them. But just speculating about the future, it's still my thoughts. It's what I think might happen. And so if it's coming from you, then it's your truth.
Does it get into tricky territory if you start speculating about what other characters might be thinking, motivated by, where it's sort of you're sort of crossing the line into taking stepping into someone else's shoes? Does that change things?
I'm a little leery about that to some extent, in that I don't write, like, say, out of a sense of revenge or wanting to say, oh, this person was just doing something horrible to me or something. I don't approach it from that angle. But if I'm speculating in a more without sort of kind
Agenda?
of, yeah, thank you, without an agenda, and really I'm trying to make sense of them, like say, why did my father molest me? So I'm not like that it's not a revenge memoir at all. It's really trying to make sense of my childhood. And so I think if we're careful to really do it thoughtfully and gracefully and with sort of a wide open heart to try to understand why people do things, I think that's very legitimate. So if you don't start out with an agenda, but you start out with a need to know, a need to understand, then I think you're on solid ground.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, finally, I think it's a great place to end is this idea. I'm going to quote something you wrote in your book, that memoir is the music of ordinary people. I love that. I have never heard it said like that before. I personally have always wished I was a musician because music moves me like more than words, actually, and yet I don't seem to have that gift. So I just love the idea that I might be helping others make music is so cool, such a cool idea. Um,
Thank you.
what, yeah. So I mean, what do you mean by that? And also it seems to be tied into this idea, like memoir as, well, what do you mean by that, first of all?
Somebody just asked if you could just repeat that quote
Oh, that
again.
memoir is the music of
Yeah.
ordinary people.
Yeah. So, yeah. So my book is Settling Torch Songs. That's what the book sort of promotes in that, you know, so the first big wave of memoir sort of started in the mid 1990s. Before that, really celebrities wrote their autobiographies, which is really just like how wonderful they were as being president or singer or movie star or whatever. Um, so it was more thought of in terms of famous people. And then really the big wave of memoir was started by women and people whose voices had been traditionally ignored, you know, BIPOC writers, LGBTQ plus writers. We started telling our stories, and we're all ordinary people. I mean, you know, all the memoirs I read, nobody's famous. We're writers, and so it is. And I sort of equate it to a lot of the folk music of the '60s, you know, that is sort of really came out, you know, around civil rights and the Vietnam War and stuff like that, that just ordinary people sort of rising up to have their voices heard. And I see the tradition of memoir and these personal essays as sort of part of that lineage of ordinary people being heard.
Mm.
You know, it's like a giant women's march on Washington,
Mm-hmm.
or, you know, civil rights marches, stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
That these are our voices, these are our stories. And if we have the gift of being writers, then great, because we can write our stories. So, but we're just ordinary people, and we are writing our ordinary lives with a big but, because we have to make our lives seem sort of extraordinary. And guess what? You do that through metaphor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, you even say that you believe that the sort of explosion of memoir in the 90s is like laid the groundwork for the Me Too movement.
It absolutely did. It absolutely did. I mean, people who had just been silenced for so long, you know, around domestic violence, just all of these things. Nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about incest.
Mm.
Just, and so all of a sudden, like this shell cracked and our voices just came out. And I think all the, you know, these memoirs absolutely did help instigate the hashtag Me Too movement. You know, that our voices are important.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It seems to keep growing. It's like not a trend. It's just it's a bigger movement. And I mean, it's no surprise. I think that the large majority. I don't know how it is for you and at Vermont, where you teach, but the large majority of students and people writing are women. Do you find that's
In at Vermont College of Fine Arts, we have a majority of women. That is absolutely true. In all genres, poetry, creative nonfiction, and fiction. And it is because we have been silenced for so long.
mm,
And now it's our turn to speak. And I think we're going to keep speaking and keep speaking. I mean, they're just, we all have a, you know, everybody does have a story to tell, and everybody does have a voice. And so this, and more than one. I mean, so I've written these four, two memoirs, two essay collections, and I'm just finishing another essay collection. And again, I'm just this little ordinary person. I mean, nothing extraordinary has happened to me. And it seems a little like, it could seem sort of egotistical. Sue, you have so much to say about yourself. But yes, I do. As a matter of fact, I do. And I'm going to keep talking.
Mm-hmm. What do you say to the writers who have a, that sort of fear crops up of backlash, whatever that means, in a very, personal way, or in a kind of a bigger backlash out in the world?
You own your voice, you own your story, tell it anyway. I mean, don't let the naysayers stop you, because that means that they still win. That means that the patriarchy still has the power to silence you. And don't give them your power. I mean, we own our stories, and it's very empowering to, like, now I control my narrative. Growing up, my father controlled my narrative. Now I can control my narrative. I can tell my story the way it needs to be told. And so, and when you are writing, don't think about anybody in the outside world. Just focus on the story you need to tell. Put the outside world in another box. You don't have to deal with that until you've finished your work. So first, just write. Get down the story that you want to tell. And then, ultimately, I mean, you don't have to publish it if you don't want to. I hope you do. But don't even worry, because I did get a lot of backlash, actually, mostly about Lovesick. And I was a little caught off guard. I mean, it was mainly men who now sort of saw me as I'm off the market. I want to be sexually sober. And so it seemed to piss off some men in our mainstream media. And I was a little caught off guard, I'll say. But I'm glad I didn't even think about it before I wrote the book. I might have second guessed myself. So don't second guess yourself. Just write. And then whatever happens. And the fact of the matter is, the feedback I really got was so positive from, just, again, regular, ordinary people who read the book, who tell me how much it helped them understand their own lives, whether they're struggling with sex addiction or just something else, just figuring life out. And so those are the responses that are the most meaningful. And whatever backlash there is, just let it go. Because you do own your story. It's your voice. You have a right to speak it, write it, tell it.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Settling torch songs, everyone. Thank you so much, Sue.
Thank you. Really lovely. And thank you for all the great questions, everybody. And thanks for being here.